Buenas tardes. Vamos a empezar mientras los demás miran el partido de Francia. No te preocupes. Yo también quiero saber qué pasa. Gracias a CIPI, a ISRI, al embajador Cabañas por la invitación. Es un placer estar acá con ustedes y facilitar este próximo panel sobre la política extranjera enfocada en el clima y nuevas oportunidades para cooperación entre Cuba y Estados Unidos con la energía limpia y la resiliencia climática. Soy Valerie Miller, la directora del programa de Cuba del Fondo para la Defensa del Medio Ambiente. Es una ONG en inglés, Enviromental Defense Fund, conocido como EDF. EDF es una organización ambientalista global que tiene una historia de más de 50 años y nuestro programa con Cuba lleva más que 22 años y tengo el placer y el honor de participar en el programa por los últimos 10 y ahora dirijo el equipo de EDF que colabora con Cuba. La mayoría de nuestro trabajo ha enfocado principalmente en los asuntos de la conservación marina, el desarrollo sostenible, la pesca sostenible y el fortalecimiento de las redes de aprendizaje entre Cuba, Estados Unidos y Latinoamérica. Pero en los últimos 2-3 años, EDF ha pasado por un periodo de transformación. Hemos crecido mucho, ahora somos más que 1,000 personas trabajando en la organización en todo el mundo. Tenemos programas en Estados Unidos, en China, en Japón, en México, en Chile y Perú y muchos más países. Y hemos reorientado nuestra estrategia para estar completamente enfocado en el cambio climático, la mitigación y la adaptación y resiliencia, con un enfoque especial en la gente, en la justicia ambiental y la economía. Entonces, con este cambio en mente, este año decidimos organizar un panel sobre un tema de alta importancia de la región, la energía limpia y la resiliencia climática. Los expertos acá, los panelistas, van a compartir con ustedes avances en la política energética, casos de estudio, lecciones aprendidas y oportunidades para mejorar la cooperación. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Voy a dar la palabra al primer panelista, Orlando Rey. Orlando es asesor en cambio climático del Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología y Medio Ambiente y desde 1985 ha estado involucrado en el desarrollo de políticas y legislación relacionados con el medio ambiente y los recursos naturales en Cuba. Gracias, Orlando, por estar acá con nosotros.
Gracias, Valerie. Buenas tardes y gracias por la oportunidad de
Thank you, Valerie.
estar en el panel.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to be here in this panel.
La idea de que hiciera esta primera presentación,
The idea of me having this, presenting this paper,
que enmarcara estos dos grandes temas de la resiliencia y bajo en carbono, desarrollo bajo en carbono,
which could include these two topics, resilience and low carbon development,
dentro de las políticas públicas de Cuba.
within the Cuban public policies.
Este concepto en su totalidad, o sea, la idea de un desarrollo resiliente y bajo en carbono,
This concept in its whole, to a development, resilient and low carbon development,
aparece por primera vez en las políticas cubanas cuando en septiembre del 2020
appears for the first time in our Cuban policies when in September 2020,
el Consejo de Ministros aprueba las proyecciones del Plan de Estado para el enfrentamiento al cambio climático,
the Council of Ministers outlines the projections for the climate change,
que son comúnmente conocidas como Tarea Vida, o sea,
which
las
are commonly known
proyecciones
as
de Tarea Vida.
Tarea Vida, task
Ahora,
life.
detrás de esos dos conceptos hay una larga historia
Behind those two concepts, there's a long history
y discusiones nacionales.
and national discussions as well.
Lo primero en la resiliencia, yo voy a abordarlo por razones de tiempo de manera muy elemental,
I will just cover this aspect very quickly, to save time.
es que en temas de adaptación al cambio climático
is that in terms of adaptation to climate change,
hemos ido evolucionando
we have been evolving
de una visión que reacciona a eventos extremos, los huracanes, los
from a
grandes,
vision that reacts to extreme events, hurricanes,
a la conciencia, que es lo que ven ahí en pantalla,
to the consciousness, which you see there on screen,
de que en Cuba se está produciendo un cambio del clima radical y permanente.
that in Cuba a change of climate, a radical and permanent change of climate is taking place,
Que va a influir en cómo organizamos el turismo, la
Which
agricultura,
which will include
El
how we
transporte.
organize tourism, agriculture, transportation,
en cómo nos vestimos, en cómo nos alimentamos.
and how we dress and how we feed ourselves.
En un escenario incluso donde no hubiera por unos años
In
un
an es-
evento extremo, un gran huracán,
In a scenario where there is a hurricane or an extreme event, will not take place.
dicho de paso, los huracanes no son una consecuencia directa o exclusiva del cambio climático.
Well, by the way, let me say that hurricanes are not a result, a conclusive result of the climate change.
Todos esos factores se iban a mantener.
All these factors would be, would maintain.
Por tanto, nosotros tenemos que repensar el desarrollo en Cuba en
Therefore,
condiciones de un clima cambiante.
We have to rethink development in Cuba in a scenario of a changing climate.
Y esa es la idea de la resiliencia.
And that's the idea of the resilience.
Ese es un término que como ecología viene de las ciencias naturales
That's a term that comes from ecology, from natural sciences,
para referirse a la capacidad de absorber impactos, de adaptarse a esos impactos,
to refer to the capacity, to the ability of absorbing impacts, of resisting those impacts.
y hoy tiene un uso mucho más amplio en el campo económico, social.
And today has a wider use in the social and economic sphere.
Pero es un tema debatido y aún este cambio de pensamiento hacia la resiliencia tenemos que seguirlo trabajando nacionalmente.
But it's a topic that has been largely debated. And this change of the topic of resilience is a topic that needs to be continue to be addressed and discussed.
El otro componente de la relación es el desarrollo bajo en carbono.
The other element of this relation is the low carbon development,
que también ha sido complejo para la política,
which has been very complex for policy,
porque en términos de la participación en las emisiones globales, la contribución de Cuba es muy pequeña,
because in terms of the global emissions of carbon, Cuba's contribution is very low.
es una fracción de unidad, 0,2%,
So
0,09%,
0.2% in terms of units,
según el año de referencia que se tome.
according to the year of reference that is taken.
Y por otra parte necesitamos crecer en economía,
And on the other hand, we need to grow in terms in economic terms,
lo cual significa crecer en emisión.
which means to grow to increase emissions.
De hecho, las emisiones de Cuba alcanzaron su punto más alto en 1990
In fact, emissions in Cuba reached their highest peak in 1990,
y nunca hemos recobrado ese nivel de emisión.
and we have never recovered that level of emissions.
En esa situación, la idea de un desarrollo bajo en emisiones
In that context, the idea of a low carbon development,
es que,
of a low emission development,
en primer lugar es desarrollo.
is that it means first it means development.
De manera que en una situación donde las emisiones crecen,
In such a way that in a scenario where emissions grow,
que sería ahí la rayita superior,
which will be the top line,
es lo que se llama un escenario bajo, un escenario business as usual, que es un escenario sin reducción de emisiones.
that's a scenario without the reduction of emissions.
Usted lo que
That's
hace es
what it means.
planificar
What-
cuánto menos crecería
What to do is to plan how less it would increase
a través de una mayor eficiencia energética,
through through a greater energy efficiency,
tanto en la línea de eficiencia como de renovabilidad de la energía.
both in the line of efficiency as in the renewability of the energy.
Y sobre eso hay toda una serie de medidas ya en diseño e implementación en Cuba,
And on that, there are a lot of measures in place in Cuba and being designed, some measures,
que después Wenceslao aquí en el panel se va a referir más.
which
a ello.
Wenceslao will refer later on in the panel.
Ahora, ¿dónde vino el problema?
Where did we find the problem
Para la discusión interna.
for the
Siendo
internal discussion?
un país que apenas aporta a las emisiones globales,
being a country that just contributes to the global emissions,
que además no causamos el problema climático, por tanto somos víctimas, sufrimos ese problema.
and we do not cause the climate change, we suffer, that problem. That
Un primer pensamiento es, bueno, que reduzcan las emisiones los responsables de esas emisiones, los grandes responsables.
the first thought would be that those responsible countries should decrease the emissions.
Entonces, en ese escenario de grandes responsables, que son los que aportan la gran carga de emisiones,
And in that scenario where we have a larger, major responsible countries who issue or who emit a lot of emissions,
y en un país como Cuba, donde la adaptación es la prioridad,
and in a country like Cuba where adaptation is the priority,
este tema de reducir emisiones,
this topic of reducing emissions,
que es lo que se llama mitigación en el lenguaje climático,
which is what we call mitigation in climate terminology,
siempre estuvo relegado.
was always behind.
Sin embargo, hemos tenido que enfrentarnos a eso.
However, we have managed to face that.
Primero, porque detrás de las acciones de mitigación
First, because behind those actions of mitigation,
hay una serie de conveniencias económicas.
there are a lot of economic conveniences.
Cuando usted mitiga, consume menos combustible fósil,
When you mitigate, you consume less fossil fuels,
del cual carecemos en la cantidad que necesitamos.
which we have in scarcity or we don't have in the amount that we need.
Disminuimos contaminación,
We decrease contamination, pollution,
todos los efectos que tiene en la salud y la calidad de vida de las personas.
with all the effect it has on the on health and the quality of life of people.
Y también nos adaptamos a un entorno internacional
And also we adapt to an international environment
donde algunas de estas medidas van a tornarse inevitables.
where some of these measures will become inevitable.
Voy a mencionar un solo ejemplo por razón de tiempo.
I will just mention one example.
Decisiones recientes de la Unión Europea
Recent decisions by the European Community
indican que a partir de
Commission,
2035 ya no
Union,
estarían produciendo vehículos a fósil. Desde
by
el
the, year,
2035.
by the year 2035, they will not be manufacturing low
Vehículos en base
a combustible
fósiles.
fósil.
they will not be manufacturing vehicles based on fossil fuels.
Por tanto, una transición a vehículos que no empleen fósiles,
Therefore, a transition to those vehicles that do not use fossil fuels,
sean eléctricos
whether electric
o con otros bioproductos,
or with other bioproducts,
es prácticamente inevitable
is practicably
por las condiciones de
inevitable
mercado que se avecinan.
due to the conditions of the market that are looming ahead.
Entonces, hacer ese cambio en Cuba del transporte
Therefore, to make that change of transportation in Cuba
ayuda a resolver las cuestiones de transporte,
will help to solve the transportation problems,
ayuda a reducir la contaminación del transporte
will help to reduce pollution caused by transportation.
y al propio tiempo nos acomoda a los escenarios internacionales.
At the same time, it can accommodate us to the international scenarios.
Con ese pensamiento, ¿qué pasó en apenas 3 años?
With that thinking, what happened in just 3 years?
Lo que ustedes tienen en pantalla
What you see on the screen
es la portada del Plan de Estado para enfrentar el cambio climático.
is the cover of the state
Tarea vida.
the life task,
Ya,
the Cuban state program to face climate change,
que fue adoptada por el gobierno en abril del 2017.
which was adopted by the government in April 2017.
Y solo en la tarea 8
And only in task 8,
hay una referencia a la mitigación.
there's a reference to mitigation.
No hay mención a la resiliencia
There is no mentioning of resilience.
y no mención al desarrollo bajo en carbono.
It doesn't mention low carbon development either.
Pero cuando en el 2020 adoptamos las proyecciones de esa misma tarea vida,
But when in the year 2020, we adopted the projections of that tarea vida, that life task,
ya entonces se pone como objetivo
it is included as an objective,
lo que precisamente es el tema de esta presentación,
which is precisely the topic of this presentation,
el desarrollo resiliente y bajo en emisiones.
the resilient and low carbon development.
Yo puse ahí abajo solo un ejemplo
I just put one example,
porque las proyecciones de tarea vida están llenas de referencia al tema de la resiliencia y bajo en carbono,
because the reference of Tarea Vida include include reference to the resilience and low carbon development.
y es que en 5 sectores clave que
And it
están
is
ahí,
that in 5 major sectors,
que son la
which you can see
industria,
there,
la
which are
construcción,
industry,
transporte, turismo y
construction,
agricultura,
transport, tourism, and agriculture,
esperamos para el final de este periodo 2025
we hope that by the end of this period, that's for the year 2025,
haber aplicado ese gráfico que antes presenté
we will have applied that the graphic or the diagram that had shown you before,
y tener trazadas las trayectorias de desarrollo bajo en carbono para esos sectores.
and to have the already outlined the trajectory or the path for the low carbon development for that period.
Ya, y eso es todo. Gracias.
And that's it. That's all.
Muchas gracias, Orlando. Nuestro próximo panelista es Mark Brownstein. Mark es vicepresidente senior de nuestra organización EDF y lidera el trabajo de transición energética, dando forma a las estrategias de la organización para acelerar la descarbonización en los principales sectores emisores, incluidos la energía y el transporte. Es reconocido como un experto en la política energética y el tema de la contaminación por metano. Gracias, Mark.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here. It is my first time here in Cuba, and so it's really my pleasure, my honor to be here. I want to talk a few minutes about the larger climate context. I will then talk a little bit about some of the things happening in the United States, and then talk about an opportunity that I think is shared between the U.S. and Cuba. So first, big picture. To achieve a stable climate, to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement that both the United States and Cuba are signatories to, there is consensus that we need to dramatically reduce the use of fossil fuels around the world. Whether you look at the work of the United Nations or the International Energy Agency, everyone agrees that we need to reduce the use of coal roughly on the order of 95% globally, the use of oil 60%, and the use of natural gas, methane, by 40%, generally speaking. That's from today's levels. Okay? And we need to do that roughly in the next 30 years. Huge challenge. Not the least of which because, as has been said, there are many economies around the world that are still developing and growing. And of course, the common assumption is that growth requires more energy, not less energy. So this is a fundamental challenge. But it's even a challenge for large industrialized countries like the United States as well, that have mature economies but are very dependent today, particularly on oil and gas. My second point here is that while we need to make those dramatic reductions, I think it's well understood that different countries, different regions will have different paths to decarbonization. I'll give you an example. Africa today is responsible for roughly 3.5% of the total greenhouse gas pollution going into the atmosphere today. The entire continent of Africa, 3.5%. If Africa were to develop all of its oil and gas reserves, it might add another 0.5% to global emissions. And so it is entirely possible that the continent of Africa will continue to develop fossil fuels while countries like the United States and Europe and China take dramatic efforts to reduce their fossil fuel consumption and their emissions. different paths for different regions. But that being said, there are lots of good reasons why even in Africa, countries would pursue strategies to reduce fossil fuel use. As has been said, there are huge air quality benefits when we stop burning coal, when we stop burning oil. And there are huge energy security advantages to decreasing the use of oil and gas. We all see the dramatic impact that geopolitics have on both the price and supply of oil and gas. I know it's felt here in Cuba. It's felt as well in the United States. It's felt everywhere in the world. And this actually becomes one of the reasons why you're seeing many economies move more aggressively, ultimately to move away from oil and gas in an effort to address that geopolitical liability. So, even if a country doesn't care much about climate, there are very good reasons for countries to take steps to reduce fossil fuel use. Okay? And we see that in China, we see that in India, perhaps maybe that's even true here in Cuba. So, in the United States, the path to decarbonization really consists of 4 basic strategies. The first is energy efficiency. Get the same amount of economic output, or maybe an increase in economic output by using less energy per unit of output. And there are huge opportunities in the United States for energy efficiency, so that is foundational. The second is the development of, is getting fossil fuels out of the electric generation sector. For the longest time, the electric generation sector in the United States was the largest source of greenhouse gas pollution in the US. And that's beginning to change. But getting the electricity to be zero carbon is essential. And that leads to step number 3, which is to use that zero carbon electricity to begin the process of taking the carbon out of transportation. So as has been said, the electrification of passenger vehicles in the United States, the electrification of buses, and even trucks is a significant step, because if power plants were the largest source of greenhouse gas pollution in the US, transportation was the second largest. And so by decarbonizing one sector, we can actually then use that electricity to decarbonize the second. Okay, so those are 1, 2, 3. And then the 4th step is, although electricity can do a lot to meet energy needs in transportation and in buildings, the technology today is not sufficient to do everything that we would like zero carbon electricity to do. An example of that is aviation. We don't yet have options for having airplanes run on electricity. We don't really have options to do international shipping using electricity. Right? There are technologies that could be useful for, ferries, or for, maybe fishing boats that were close to shore, but not any kind of ship that has to go long distances. And it's also true that electricity can't serve all of the industrial needs. And so there is a need for molecules, and in the United States, there is increasing look to hydrogen as a source of molecules for aviation fuels and for shipping fuels, and also biomass. Now, 2 things about hydrogen and biomass. Both of them are actually scarce. Hydrogen is actually the most abundant element in the world. but it always exists glued onto some other molecule, right? H2O. Okay? And it turns out it takes a lot of energy to get the hydrogen separated from the oxygen. And so it is very energy intensive to produce hydrogen, and therefore very expensive, and that's why hydrogen is very valuable and very scarce. Biomass, same thing. Biomass can play a role in helping us to decarbonize our economy, but if it comes at the expense of cutting down our forests, if it comes at the expense of producing food, right? The United States made arguably, it was a questionable decision to put a lot of emphasis on the production of ethanol from corn. Although this was very good for the farmers, it has put pressure on food supply. Okay? And also, it is not clear that you actually get much carbon benefit because it takes so much energy to grow the corn in the first instance, right? You have the tractor, you have the fertilizer, so on. Okay? So sustainable biomass is actually also a rare commodity. Right? The last thing we want to see is a country producing alternative fuels by cutting down forests or stressing food supplies. This is not what we need. So you will see in the United States the Inflation Reduction Act, otherwise known as the IRA, or IRA as we say, was a set of measures that was enacted by the US Congress that now create tremendous incentives for decarbonization in the United States. And if you look at that giant package, you'll see that the incentives fall into one of the four buckets that I just described. Okay. And the United States has chosen for the moment to advance climate policy through this set of incentives to stimulate the private sector channel investment into efficiency, into electrification, into production of electric vehicles and the charging infrastructure, into the development of hydrogen and sustainable biofuels. Environmental Defense Fund is playing a very large role, not only in helping to get that package passed, but then now to define the set of regulations that are necessary to take the intent of Congress and make it effective through a government, through the bureaucracy. Yep. Okay. I think you would find that if you looked at European climate policy, it would also very much fall into these four buckets. And in fact, if you were to look at policy for China, you would also see that it largely falls into these four categories. So I think that's the context in which Cuba and other countries in the Caribbean and elsewhere are operating within. So where is the shared opportunity? When I said that we were going to reduce oil by 60% and natural gas by 40%, and everyone sort of gasped when I said we have to do this in 30 years, what it means, two things it means, is that oil and gas will be with us for some time to come. And in fact, note, I did not say that oil and gas go to zero. And so there is going to continue to be a need to have policies in place that do a good job of managing the environmental footprint of oil and gas for many decades to come. One of the biggest opportunities to have an immediate impact on climate change is reducing methane pollution associated with oil and gas and methane pollution associated with agriculture. When we talk about climate change, many people often think about carbon dioxide, which builds up in the atmosphere over time and stays there for millennia. And that determines the total amount of warming that our planet will experience over time. That's the blanket is getting ever thicker. Methane also is an important climate pollutant, and that doesn't last long in the atmosphere, but while it's in the atmosphere, it is much more effective at trapping the Earth's heat than CO2. And so methane in the atmosphere accelerates warming. And what we now know is that to have an effective strategy to combat climate change, you need to reduce the total amount of CO2, which is about the warming that our great-grandchildren will experience. Right? We're living with the legacy of the CO2 that our forebears gave to us, and reduce methane, which is about the rate of warming today. The most effective thing that we can do right now to slow the rate of warming is to slow the amount of methane. Methane is natural gas, and methane is very much not only an energy source, but it's also a byproduct of oil and gas production. So we've come to understand that the most cost-effective strategy that we have to reduce warming today is to reduce methane emissions. So now, the United States is the world's largest oil and gas producer. So the United States has a responsibility to be a leader in reducing methane emissions. And the good news here is that under the Biden administration, the U.S. now is proposing a very aggressive set of regulations to reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. So that's positive. But what's also true is that it's a global problem. And so we are working to make sure that all of the oil and gas industry around the world is engaged in reducing these emissions, whether you're talking about the United States, or you're talking about the Middle East, or you're talking about Asia. And so I spend a lot of time in all these places talking about this issue. And we have developed both strategies to reduce emissions, and we've also developed technologies that allow us to measure these emissions, which is the first step in reducing them. But what we've also come to understand is that there are methane emissions associated with agriculture, particularly the raising of beef cattle and dairy cattle. And increasingly, there are strategies to address that. And why I say this is a shared opportunity is because, again, if you think about methane not just as a climate pollutant, but also as an energy source, natural gas, every step that we take, every molecule that we prevent going into the atmosphere is a molecule that we can use in the meantime for fuel. We just released a study this week that shows that we can make substantial reductions in methane and provide substantial amounts of energy into the marketplace in the next 2 years. So it's a double win. It's reducing the impact on the climate, and it's also giving us greater access to energy today. And I think that this is a shared opportunity because whether that methane is coming from oil and gas use or agriculture, it becomes an opportunity both for energy security and climate security. And so that is one of the strategies that we're pursuing as we work towards the larger vision of decarbonization. I'll stop there.
Muchísimas gracias, Mark. La próxima panelista es Liliana Nuñez Vélez, la presidenta de la Fundación Antonio Núñez Jiménez para la Naturaleza y el Hombre. Liliana ha trabajado con la Fundación desde su inicio en 1994. Tiene 25 años de experiencia dirigiendo programas que conectan la academia, la ciencia y la cultura, y de diálogos multidisciplinarios con un impacto en la toma de decisiones hacia la sostenibilidad. Muchísimas gracias, Liliana.
Muchísimas gracias a EDF por esta invitación. Y yo quisiera transmitir, creo que voy a hablar no solamente en nombre de la Fundación, sino de todo un movimiento civil cubano apoyando los procesos que el gobierno siempre ha desarrollado de cuidado ambiental.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation, and I would like to speak not only on behalf of the Antonio Núñez Jiménez Foundation, but also on behalf of all the Cuban society that support all the government initiatives to protect the environment.
Y en ese sentido, exponiendo un poco los roles que tenemos como sociedad civil en fortalecer las políticas que en un momento determinado se plantean como estrategias muy centralizadas, como deben ser las estrategias, pero el rol que tenemos las organizaciones ambientalistas en Cuba para promover que en la táctica, o sea, la aplicación de esa estrategia táctica sea lo más descentralizada posible para fortalecer los valores y las opciones locales.
And in this regard, I would like to say that our role as members of the civil society and as environmentalist activists, our role is to support these highly centralized initiatives, but as environmental organizations, our role is to implement the tactics of the government is in the most decentralized way possible at a local level.
Porque como bien se expuso anteriormente por Orlando, o sea, Cuba, incluso aunque el clima está cambiando, cada localidad tiene una particularidad muy específica.
Because as Orlando said earlier, even though the Cuban climate is changing, the different places has different climate characteristics.
Y entonces, en este sentido, por ejemplo, lo que el movimiento de permacultura cubano, el movimiento de permacultura criolla cubana ha demostrado en los últimos 25 años, ofrece una cantera de conocimiento para la ciencia y desde los conocimientos tradicionales de cómo enfrentar todo lo que la ciencia está explicando desde una forma en que pueda ser aplicable para los gobiernos locales, los municipios y las propias comunidades.
And in this case, the Cuban Creole Permaculture Organization is been helping to take the knowledge that is available and help to apply it in the localities.
En momentos en que también el rol, como vemos el rol también de por ejemplo, la Fundación Antonio Núñez Jiménez, ahora voy a hablar específicamente de la organización en la que trabajo. Muchas veces las políticas de gobierno en la estrategia están muy bien diseñadas y el papel de nuestras organizaciones o de la Fundación ha sido hacer un complemento o un apoyo a esas políticas. Cuando a veces el contexto nacional o internacional es adverso, muchas veces la propia dinámica local de estas organizaciones permite poder hacer un avance ahí donde el Estado tiene determinados o los planes de gobierno tienen determinados tropiezos, es posible avanzar. Yo creo que esa es mi mensaje más importante en este contexto, es entender que allí donde las organizaciones tienen un rol de experiencia, que puedan avanzar aun cuando el contexto sea adverso. Estoy hablando de las relaciones Cuba-Estados Unidos específicamente.
And now I'm going to talk on behalf of the foundation. Even though the government policies are strategically well designed, our role is to create a complement to these policies. So in the places where these policies face obstacles, the organizations can make some advance. That's the main role of our organization.
Y en lo que da basamento a ese rol es la capacidad de no establecer jerarquías al incorporar diferentes sectores que tienen que recibir o ofrecer un impacto local en la naturaleza. O sea, no hay jerarquía, la ciencia y la naturaleza no jerarquizan, todo está integrado, tiene que tener un análisis muy holístico y es lo que la Fundación en su dinámica intenta aplicar, fortalecer procesos de concertación, de diálogos ambientales donde todos los actores estén en igualdad de condiciones de ofrecer una voz y una acción.
And this is because we do not establish a hierarchy between the different sectors, especially when they have the power of decision or impact on the nature. Because science and nature should be approached from a holistic perspective, and also because we must help strengthen the dialogue about environment protection.
Y ya para terminar, estas frases a veces pueden lucir un poco idílicas, un poco utópicas, pero conllevan un trabajo muy sistemático, muy profundo, donde el respeto a las ciencias, tanto las naturales como las sociales, tienen que estar en igualdad de tratamiento. Entonces eso conlleva realmente, a veces yo sé que los ambientalistas pienso que a veces la comunicación nos ha fallado en los últimos años. Yo pienso que 20 años se han perdido. Recuerdo los procesos, por ejemplo, en GEF, en la UICN, de cómo incorporar a la empresa, al mundo empresarial, al mundo económico. Costó mucho trabajo que los ambientalistas entendiéramos que ese diálogo era importantísimo y que el tema económico, si no se incorpora a los planes ambientales, no vamos a tener éxito, o por lo menos no en la velocidad que los problemas ambientales necesitan.
Although this may sound as some utopian phrases, it shows the systematic and deep work in which we show equal respect for all sciences. I think there's been some communication issues, and that we environmentalists has wasted the last 20 years. I remember that when we worked with the GEF and the IUCN, it was difficult for us to understand that we have to bring the business community into our world, because they would help achieve our objectives faster. And it took us some time to understand that.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Liliana. El próximo panelista es Dan Whittle. Dan es director senior del programa del Caribe de EDF, liderando la estrategia de la región en base de más de 2 décadas de experiencia en promover la colaboración ambiental entre Cuba y Estados Unidos. En los años recientes ha dirigido un equipo en Puerto Rico que busca brindar electricidad limpia, accesible y confiable a través de un proyecto de energía solar impulsado por una comunidad. Su presentación es sobre nuevas oportunidades de cooperación en el uso de energía renovable.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you, Ambassador Cabañas, for including me again in this session. This is my colleague Mark's first trip to Cuba. This is my 100th trip to Cuba. So I will celebrate tonight with a mojito. So for the last few years, I have actually been working in Puerto Rico. So after Hurricane Maria in 2017, Environmental Defense Fund asked me to work in Puerto Rico, and I said, I don't know anything about Puerto Rico. I've never been there. And they said, you know Cuba, so you know Puerto Rico. and I later learned that Puerto Rico and Cuba are wings of the same bird. But at that time, I did not know that, so I learned it gradually. So today I want to talk about 3 things. I want to talk about Puerto Rico and its path to a renewable energy future. And second, I want to talk about the situation here in Cuba with respect to clean energy, energy security, and a low-carbon economy, and the similarities between Puerto Rico and Cuba. And third, I especially want to talk about opportunities for cooperation between the U.S. and Cuba on clean energy and climate change. And let's start with Puerto Rico. On September 18th of this year, Hurricane Fiona made landfall in Puerto Rico almost 5 years to the day after Hurricane Maria struck in 2017. Hurricane Maria destroyed the electric grid throughout the island, and it caused more than 3,000 deaths. 3,000, which is a tremendous number. And Fiona this year was not as powerful as Maria. It was a Category 1 versus a Category 5 hurricane, but it still caused significant damage. After Fiona, Puerto Rico, like here in Cuba, experienced a total island-wide blackout for a period of days, and many communities had to wait weeks for power and water to be restored. And so Fiona underscored what Puerto Ricans already knew, that the island's centralized electric grid was still fragile, and efforts to rebuild it after Hurricane Maria were too slow. They hadn't worked. And in fact, before Fiona, all summer long, Puerto Rico experienced power outages. And there were protests against the government of Puerto Rico because of its failure to be able to provide reliable power. Also, they realized that billions and billions of dollars that the U.S. Congress had allocated after Maria has still not been spent 5 years later. Only 19% of the $20 billion had been spent in 5 years, largely because of bureaucratic red tape and a lack of commitment from the Trump administration. But I don't want to talk about all the terrible things. Notwithstanding the tragedies of Maria and Fiona, there are reasons to be hopeful in Puerto Rico. For instance, Hurricane Maria spawned important changes in policy. In 2019, the Puerto Rican legislature enacted a new law, the Energy Policy Act, that requires Puerto Rico to generate 40% of its electricity, 40% of its electricity from renewable energy by 2025. And right now it's about 5%. So that's a very ambitious target. 100% by 2050. In the year 2020, the Puerto Rico Energy Bureau ordered the utility to revise its plans to make sure that the targets could be met. And basically what they said to the utility is, you need to phase out natural gas and diesel and coal. And you can't continue to have a rationale to include those in the energy future. But what's really impressive since Hurricane Maria is that the people have acted. Communities have acted on their own. They're not waiting for the government. Since 2017, the amount of solar panels on residential rooftops in Puerto Rico has grown by 4 times, by 400%. And private businesses in particular are installing solar energy and batteries because it makes sense for their business. We're also seeing new manufacturing of panels, and we're seeing literally hundreds of small companies that are installing solar panels and batteries in people's homes. So it's been a real economic opportunity. Puerto Rico has a policy like Cuba, I believe, called net metering, which allows residents to generate their own power and to sell excess energy back to the grid. And this makes the cost of solar energy much cheaper, more affordable. And there are other bright spots. Consider the small island of Culebra, where I work, off the northeast coast of Puerto Rico. After Hurricanes Irma and Maria, 1,700 residents in Culebra waited for 13 months for electricity to be restored, over a year. Many of these residents are low income, many are old and elderly, many have special medical requirements, and a lack of access to reliable energy is a serious threat to their health and well-being. In the small island of Culebra, they often say we're the la cola de la cola. You know, we're a small island off the big island. There's a strong sustainability ethic. So not only in energy, but you see it in food security, sustainable agriculture, and ecotourism, and public health. So they're starting to try to be self-sufficient and not rely on the main island. And they want Culebra to become the first solar island in the United States. And I think they're going to be successful. Enviromental Defense Fund has been supporting them in that effort. And this summer, right before Fiona, we completed a project that brought solar panels and batteries to 45 homes, mostly low-income homes. We finished the project literally right before Fiona. So when Fiona was coming, the people with solar panels and batteries were not as worried. They knew they had power, and como se dice in Espanol, they had peace of mind. Tranquilidad. So, and they worked. And so when Hurricane Fiona came, they were able to keep the lights on. And now we're seeing that Culebra is an example for other communities who are trying to attract investment to do their own solar systems. And so that's good news. You know, the issue, of course, is that especially in low-income communities, financing is hard to come by. The good news is just this summer, the Biden administration announced that it's finally going to start spending the billions of dollars that have been stuck. And they're really going to focus on getting it to low-income houses in Puerto Rico. So sustainable economic development in Puerto Rico really depends upon a successful energy transition away from fossil fuels. Puerto Rico, like any Caribbean island nation, is energy insecure. It depends upon expensive and imported fossil fuels. And so they are on a path to move away from that, which of course brings us to Cuba. Like the rest of the, and I'm telling you everything you already know, so I'll just give you our perspective. Like the rest of the Caribbean, Cuba is overly dependent upon expensive imported fossil fuels. And as everyone knows, that compromises the country's ability to be energy secure and to really grow in a sustainable way. It also affects people's lives. It's just extremely hard to suffer through power outages on a regular basis. And again, I'm telling you nothing you don't already know. The power plants in Cuba are old, and they have not been repaired or maintained in years because of a lack of funding. They're in serious need of repair. But in essence, they're really not the answer for the future. So as everyone knows, when Category 3, Hurricane Ian hit the island this fall, there were island-wide blackouts, just like Puerto Rico following Fiona, and power outages, I think, are less common in Havana right now, but they're still common throughout the island. So it's a very complex issue. And fortunately, like in Puerto Rico, there are opportunities, and the first opportunity depends upon policy. And Tarea Vida is an excellent roadmap to decarbonize the economy. I believe now the target for renewables is 37% by 2030, 30%? 24%. Okay. In Tarea Vida. Okay, so so it's still 24%, but still 24% is a long way to go from now. And ideally, oficialmente. And also, I think there's discussion here in Cuba of an energy transition that achieves a 100% goal, and there's no reason that Cuba cannot achieve 100% renewable energy by the year 2050. The cost of solar, wind, and other renewable energy technologies has been decreasing, making solar energy not only the clean thing to do, but the economically smart and sensible thing to do. So I'm going to skip a little bit here. We, in 2017, Environmental Defense Fund released a report on Cuba's electric grid, and we found that Cuba has the most decentralized energy generation in the world, next to Denmark. Now, most of those microgrids on the island are diesel-powered, but you have the infrastructure there to transition those to renewable, primarily solar energy. So you've got the architecture in place. Also, I understand that there's a policy change this summer that allows private businesses in Cuba to import solar panels and batteries from the U.S. and elsewhere. Our law allows private companies in the U.S. to export energy technologies to Cuba. So there's a real opportunity there, I believe. So the third thing I want to talk about is opportunities for U.S.-Cuba cooperation. Shortly after President Biden took office, much to the, we're all very happy that one of the first things he talked about was making climate change the focus of his domestic and his foreign policy. On January 27, 2021, just a week after he took office, he said his was a whole-of-government approach to put climate change at the center of domestic, national security, and foreign policy. And he's taken steps since then to implement that vision. At COP26 in Glasgow, the Biden administration reasserted the United States' leadership on climate, or at least intended to do so, and with leaders from the European Union launched the Global Methane Pledge that Environmental Defense Fund and my colleague Mark was very involved in, and Cuba signed the pledge shortly thereafter. At the Summit of the Americas, which we've talked about some this morning, many say that the summit was a failure, that nothing happened, and that's largely, I think, true and fair criticism. However, Vice President Harris did announce the Caribbean Partnership to address the climate crisis in 2030, called PAC 2030. And it's the principal initiative of the Biden administration in the Caribbean right now. It's focused on 4 pillars: improving access to development financing, facilitating clean energy project development and investment, enhancing local capacity building, and deepening collaboration between the U.S. and Caribbean partners. Primarily, that's the U.S. and CARICOM and the Dominican Republic as well. But in a conversation with the Department of State just last week, it's an area that the White House apparently has an intention to follow through on. So as we think about PAC 2030 and the U.S.-Caribbean partnership, it's impossible to imagine success if Cuba is not involved in that partnership. And given the national interest of the U.S. in an energy transition in the Caribbean, it makes complete sense for dialogue to resume on climate change, and specifically on how the U.S. Can support Cuba in its implementing the vision of Tarea Cuba. So, thank you.
Muchas gracias, Dan. La próxima presentación es por Wenceslao Carrera. Es director de proyecto con Cuba Energía. Tiene experiencia por más de 30 años en la gerencia integral de proyectos y programas en las áreas de energía y cambio climático, y fue gestor del Programa Nacional de Ciencia, Tecnología e Innovación en el área de eficiencia y conservación de energía en Cuba. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias a los organizadores
Thank you
por la
to
invitación.
organizers.
Voy a tratar de decir mensajes y cuando termine el mensaje usted traduce para poder facilitar entonces decía que le agradezco a los organizadores la invitación a poder intercambiar algunas ideas sobre este tema.
First, I would like to say thank you to the organizers of this event for inviting me to share some ideas on this topic.
Y por eso he organizado en 3 elementos fundamentales: cómo vemos energía y cambio climático en el país, las principales acciones de mitigación que están relacionadas con este sector, los compromisos nacionales e internacionales y las barreras y vacíos que tenemos actualmente.
And this is why I prepared this presentation with 3 points. First, as we see energy and climate change. Second, the principal actions of mitigation related to the energy sector and its impact on the international and national commitments. And third, the barriers and voids that this process have.
Voy a repetir algunas ideas muy brevemente de lo que planteaba Orlando, pero ya específicamente para el tema de energía.
I'm going to repeat some ideas that have already been said by Orlando, but that are essential to understand this topic.
Cuba presenta una altísima dependencia de los combustibles fósiles importados.
Cuba is highly dependent of imported fossil fuels.
Por otra parte, tenemos una baja utilización de las fuentes renovables de energía.
On the other hand, we have a very low use of renewable source of energy.
Y sin embargo tenemos potencial de mejora de eficiencia energética y potencial de fuentes renovables de energía.
However, we have a potential to enhance our energy efficiency and to use more renewable energy sources.
Ahora, ¿cómo esto impacta en el tema del cambio climático? Como ya se dijo aquí, el aporte de Cuba a las emisiones globales es muy bajo.
And how does this impact climatic change? As it has been said before here, Cuba's emissions are very low.
Y también, como repito, la elevada vulnerabilidad del archipiélago cubano hace que entonces la adaptación para Cuba sea una prioridad, mientras que la mitigación la vemos como una oportunidad.
And due to Cuba's high vulnerability, we see this
La adaptación como una prioridad y la mitigación como una oportunidad.
and due to Cuba's high vulnerability, we see adaptation as a priority and mitigation as an opportunity.
Y oportunidad por lo que ya se ha dicho acá, tanto de las mejoras tecnológicas internas, el uso de residuales, con todo un grupo de elementos, así como también las condiciones internas y externas que van a existir para poder tomar el camino de la mitigación.
And we call it an opportunity because, as we have said before, this allowed some improvement of the technology in the internally, and also the use of waste to mitigate some of these problems. And
A ver, de las internas, las mejoras tecnológicas y las externas por las condiciones del mercado.
internally because of the improvement in technology, and externally because of the opportunities in the market.
Cuando hablamos de mitigación, la base fundamental es el inventario de emisiones.
When we speak about mitigation, the main base is the inventory of emissions.
En Cuba hay una experiencia de la elaboración de inventarios y nos vamos a referir específicamente al último comunicado a la Convención Marco de Naciones Unidas para el Cambio Climático, que es la del 2016.
Cuba has experience creating inventory, and we're going to refer to the data included in the last communication to the Framework Convention of the United Nations on Climate Change.
Aquí solamente señalar que, fíjense, en energía, las emisiones en Cuba de todos los sectores, energía representa el 70, poquito más del 70%.
And here I would like to point it out that the emission of all the forms of energy only accounts for the 70.5% of the total of.
Y en el sector de agricultura, silvicultura y otros usos de tierra, tenemos el 20%.
And in the sector of agriculture and fish culture, and other uses of the land, we only have 20.1%.
O sea, quiero decir que en los dos sectores, o sea, el que garantiza la soberanía energética y el que garantiza la soberanía agropecuaria, son los que tienen el 91% de emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero.
And I would like to say that the two sectors that guarantee the agricultural sovereignty and the energy sovereignty amount for the 91% of the emissions in the country.
Elemento importante es la tendencia. Y en la tendencia, como podemos ver aquí en esta gráfica, que es desde el 90 hasta el 16, la tendencia última es al decrecimiento de las emisiones netas.
And it's important here is the trend. And in this graphic that goes from the 1990s to the 2016, we can see that the latest trend is to see a decrease on the number of emissions.
Pero esto no está condicionado por medidas de mitigación expresamente diseñadas, sino por la situación económica del país.
But this is not conditioned for mitigation measures taken for this purpose, but for the economic situation of the country.
Y por eso la tendencia futura va a ser obligatoriamente de crecimiento de las emisiones en correspondencia con el desarrollo planificado del país.
Therefore, the future trend is going to be a decrease that is going to be related to the economic growth of the country. Increase.
Evidentemente, con todas estas circunstancias, es que se ha reflejado en las diferentes, en el marco jurídico del país, las acciones de mitigación.
Evidently, due to all these circumstances, the mitigation actions have been included within the legal framework of the country.
En energía, específicamente el Decreto Ley 345 del desarrollo de las fuentes renovables y el uso eficiente de la energía, refleja las políticas fundamentales y las medidas, algunas de las medidas concretas a tomar.
Specifically, in the case of energy, Decree number 345 of the development of renewable energies and the efficient use of energy comprises the policies and measures that are going to be taken in this sector.
Y por supuesto, muchas de estas medidas están reflejadas en el Plan de Estado, o sea, en Tarea Vida.
And many of these measures are reflected in the life task of the Cuban government.
Que indica que deberá tenerse en cuenta el desarrollo de 12 sectores, obligatoriamente el tema de la mitigación.
That establishes that mitigations should be included in the development of 12 sectors.
Los más importantes, por supuesto, de gases de efecto invernadero.
Of course, the 12 most important regarding greenhouse effect gas.
Pero en la contribución nacionalmente determinada de Cuba,
but in the nationally set contribution of Cuba,
que es el compromiso de Cuba bajo el Acuerdo de París, o sea, a lo que Cuba se compromete internacionalmente.
Which is Cuban commitment under the Paris Agreement.
Tenemos 5 acciones de mitigación.
We have 5 mitigation actions.
Y aquí estamos hablando, claro, la primera que es del 24% al 2030.
And the first one is to increase by 24% the generation of electricity using renewable sources energy by the year 2030.
Actualmente tenemos alrededor de 5%.
Right now we are only at 5% of that goal.
Pero tenemos una que es en el incremento de la eficiencia y el ahorro de la energía.
Another contribution is the increase in the efficiency and the saving of energy.
En acciones concretas.
In concrete actions.
Tenemos otra en el transporte.
The third one is transportation.
El compromiso de Cuba es disminuir en 50% el uso del combustible fósil al 2030.
Cuba has committed to reduce the use of fossil fuel by 50% for the year 2030.
Estos son las 3 principales en energía, las 3 contribuciones principales en energía.
The three main contributions in energy.
Que son tensísimas para nuestro país.
Which are very tense for our country, very stressing.
Y las otras 2 están relacionadas con el sector agropecuario, que una es el incremento de la cobertura forestal hasta el 33% en el año 2030.
And the other 2 are related to the agriculture sector. One of them is the increase of the forest cover in 33% by 2030.
¿Por qué es tan importante? Es importante porque hoy en el inventario que tenemos, con las absorciones en ese sector, el per cápita de Cuba es 2 toneladas por cada habitante anual, muy por debajo de, por supuesto, de los emisores, no solamente los grandes, sino medios y bajos emisores.
Why this is important? Because currently, in the current inventory, Cuba has a per capita that it's under the 2 tons per inhabitant, which is even lower than the one in the countries that have the greatest emissions of carbon.
Por tanto, el desarrollo forestal para Cuba es importantísimo para las remociones de emisiones.
Therefore, forest development is essential for Cuba to reduce the emission of carbon.
Y el sector porcino, que digamos así, en crisis coyuntural, para decirlo de alguna manera, tendrá obligatoriamente que incrementarse sustantivamente para garantizar la soberanía, no solo la soberanía alimentaria del país, sino la cultura culinaria cubana.
And the porcine sector will have to increase dramatically in order to ensure Cuba's food sovereignty and to develop Cuban's cuisine.
Y ese incremento tiene que ir ligado obligatoriamente a tratamiento de residuales que conducen a disminución importante de metano.
And this increase will have to go hand in hand with actions that will increase the production of methane.
I think decrease, of course. Yes.
Will decrease the
Ajá.
production.
Bien, entonces, acá, como Cuba, eso está contenido en la primera contribución nacionalmente determinada, y no todas las que están en la contribución, o sea, todas las que están en las prohibiciones de tarea vida, están en la contribución, pero hay muchas de ellas que no son compromisos internacionales.
Many of the tasks that are included in the first national determined contribution are part of the life task, but not all of the ones that we have today are included in this contribution.
Y es porque cuando Cuba se compromete internacionalmente, tiene que ser una acción de mitigación muy elaborada técnicamente, con todos los cálculos, con todas las proyecciones, para poder decir, yo voy a disminuir en tal periodo tal cantidad.
And it is because when Cuba decides to take action and commits at an international level, they have to present a highly elaborated program with the correct calculus, so they can show the estimates of the time in which they are set to reach the goals.
Y comenzamos a trabajar en la contribución nacionalmente determinada que Cuba deberá comunicar en el 25.
And we are now working on the national determined contribution that Cuba should publish in 2025.
Y hay un objetivo de que esa contribución no sea solo del tipo de acciones, sino del tipo por debajo del tendencial.
And we are aiming to that this new contribution not only shows the actions, but also the actions that we'll take for mitigation, but also the actions that are under the trend.
Under the business as usual.
Under the business as usual trend.
¿Eso qué significa? Eso significa que nosotros vamos a incrementar como país las emisiones, pero van a estar por debajo de las emisiones que podrían suceder si no tomáramos acciones de mitigación.
What does this mean? It means that emissions are going to increase, but they are still going to remain below the ones that we will have if we don't take these actions.
Exactamente. Y esto evidentemente tiene un grupo de retos.
And of course, this poses a set of challenges.
Primero es que tenemos que realizar toda una serie de investigaciones y estudios que permitan precisamente tener esas proyecciones.
First is that we have to carry out investigations and studies that allow us to obtain the necessary projections for this contribution.
Para cada uno de los sectores, aquellos programas de desarrollo que están diseñados, hay que ver cuáles son, cómo impactan las emisiones y cómo disminuirlas.
And for each sector, we have to see how the emissions have an impact on them.
Y eso está vinculado con que entonces cada uno de esos sectores tendrá que tener estrategias menos intensas en carbono y más allá del 2030, que es hasta donde llegan las proyecciones económicas nuestras aprobadas.
Which means that each of these sectors to have a less intense carbon emission, especially after 2030, which is the deadline of this goal.
Y hasta donde están proyectadas la economía del país en el plan de desarrollo económico social 2030.
And also is the deadline of the economic and social development of the country.
Porque de lo contrario no podemos con certeza saber cuándo el país puede obtener una carbono neutralidad en la segunda mitad del siglo.
Otherwise, we will not be able to know when the country will be able to attain carbon neutrality in the second half of the century.
Y por supuesto, todos estos reportes en el plano internacional llevan a unos sistemas de medición, reporte y verificación bajo el Acuerdo de París del marco de transparencia reforzado que son realmente muy estrictos.
And all these measurements and verification systems fall under
bajo el marco de transparencia reforzado del Acuerdo de París.
Are verification processes that are in correspondence with the transparency framework under the Paris Agreement.
Exactamente, Enhanced Transparency Framework. Y por último, aquí se ha hablado de que no solamente de arriba hacia abajo las medidas, o sea, las políticas y las medidas tomadas, sino que es importante de abajo hacia arriba trabajar todos estos temas.
Lastly, we have spoken that these policies should not only go from top to bottom, but they also have to go from the bottom to the top.
Y esto lleva implícito el desarrollo de nuevas formas de gestión.
And this calls for new management ways.
Pongo un ejemplo.
For example,
Si para alcanzar el 100% bajo energías renovables en el país, no solamente hay que verlo desde el punto de vista de la generación, sino desde el punto de vista del consumo.
for example, to reach 100% use of renewable energy sources, we have to see not only from the perspective of generation, but also from the perspective of consumption.
Y eso significa la participación de muchísimas personas y muchísimos sistemas para implementar sistemas de energías renovables en el consumidor.
And it means that it will take a lot of systems of people and a lot of systems at local levels to get the people to insert themselves in this use of renewable energy sources.
Con nuevas formas de gestión económica y nuevos actores.
With new forms of economic of management for the economy and for and with new actors.
Hay que ir a nuevos modelos de negocios,
We have to create new business models,
nuevos esquemas financieros innovativos climáticos para poder hacer eso.
new financial models that offer innovation in the climate issue,
Finance. Y incentivos para todo eso.
and incentives for all of these new ways.
Y nos referimos a incentivos positivos e incentivos negativos.
And by this we mean positive and negative incentive.
Y eso requiere mucho apoyo y colaboración internacional.
And it requires a lot of international support and assistance.
Así que tenemos un campo inmenso para el cual trabajar, que nos puedan apoyar tanto Estados Unidos como otros países en esos temas cuando eso sea posible.
We have a lot to work on, and we can count with the support of the international community and of the United States as well.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Tenemos una última presentación por Luis Pérez, presidente de Cuba Solar y director general de la revista científica Ecosolar y la revista científica popular Energía II. Es experto en los temas de desarrollo territorial con recursos energéticos propios y el aprovechamiento de la energía solar, incluyendo estudios recientes de instalaciones solares para el calentamiento del agua y secadores solares. Gracias, Luis.
Podemos empezar. Dice la necesidad de la colaboración internacional en el cambio climático antropogénico.
The need of international collaboration
Dice así.
in the man-made climate change.
Una definición de desarrollo sostenible o sustentable
A definition of sustainable
es la
development
facultad de satisfacer las necesidades humanas en el tiempo presente
is the faculty of meeting
sin que ello implique comprometer la satisfacción de necesidades futuras.
it's the faculty of meeting the human needs in the present without without compromising future of those.
No es mi intención diseñar disertar aquí sobre el cambio climático y
It is not
sus
my intention to make a
causas,
dissertation on climate change,
ya que existen estudios científicos suficientes que
because there are-
demuestran no solo las causas, sino las consecuencias desastrosas para el futuro de la vida en el planeta.
because there already exist many studies on climate change, and which they already have spoken about the disastrous effect that they may have on the life of the planet.
La divulgación de estos estudios,
The publication of these studies
deber de todos los que ya los conocemos,
of all
y
those
los
who already know
aceptamos,
them,
contribuirá a la formación de una conciencia mundial globalizada
will
que
contribute
combata a los verdaderos culpables y enemigos de la humanidad. ¿Sí? Sin duda, la lucha será extremadamente dura.
without any doubt the struggle
Sencillos
will be
ejemplos
very hard.
de contaminación del medio ambiente, productos de determinadas acciones, tales como botar basura en lugares indebidos, mantener criaderos de mosquitos, lavar carros en ríos o echar desechos industriales y residuales domésticos o inclusive fumar, son actos que atentan contra la convivencia pacífica e inclusive contra nosotros mismos.
Without any doubt, the fight, the struggle will be extremely hard.
Pero quiero referirme. Sí.
Simple exercises of pollution of the environment, products that the result of certain actions, such as littering in some undue places, maintaining mosquitoes breeding places, washing cars in the rivers, and other actions will go against the peaceful coexistence and even the against ourselves.
Pero quiero referirme hoy a la importancia de la colaboración
But today I would like to refer to the importance of
entre las
collaboration
naciones relacionadas con el cambio climático producido por el ser humano,
collaboration among nations
Ya que
related
la
to the
Tierra
climate
es
change,
una sola,
because Earth is only one.
y ya tiene 8.000 millones de habitantes.
It already has 80,000 million inhabitants.
En estos hay de todo.
In this, there are
Pero una cosa es
many
real.
things. It's a real
El cambio
thing.
climático antropogénico ya se siente.
Man-made climate change
Si no
is
cambiamos,
already felt. If we don't change it,
muchos de nosotros vamos a desaparecer aunque sigamos hablando de desarrollo sostenible.
many of us will disappear, although we continue to speak about sustainable development.
Por eso es en extremo importante divulgar tanto las causas como las consecuencias del cambio climático antropogénico y lo principal, cambiar nuestra forma de actuar.
That is why it's extremely important to disclose and to spread both the causes and the consequences of climate change, of man-made climate change, and above all, to change our form of action.
Los cambios climáticos producidos por el desarrollo de la naturaleza son generalmente inevitables y a la vez muy lentos.
Climate changes as a result of from the development of nature are generally inevitable and even more slower.
Los seres vivos se van adaptando a ellos en el transcurso de miles de años. Sobre esto no me voy a referir.
Living beings adapt to them in the course of thousands of years, but about this I won't speak today.
Tiene cierta lógica que nos adaptemos a vivir en una zona ciclónica
It has some logic
y
that
además nos preparemos ante un ciclón.
we adapt ourselves to living
Pudiéramos
in a
inclusive pensar en mitigar sus daños.
to live in a hurricane area, and also that we prepare ourselves, to face those hurricanes. Also, we can even think in
Sin
mitigating
duda-
their damages.
Sin duda la adaptación y la mitigación tienen lógica cuando se trata de fenómenos naturales, pero lo que no tiene lógica es que nos adaptemos a las guerras de conquista, por mucho que digan que son para luchar contra el terrorismo y por la democracia y la libertad.
Without any doubt, the adaptation and the mitigation they have a logic when it is about natural phenomena.
Ante estas
But-
guerras,
But what has no logic is that we go to war, we unleash wars of conquest, and and whatever we say that they are for, to fight against terrorism or for democracy and liberty and freedom. Those wars, although they can be said that they are for democracy, freedom, and against terrorism.
Ante estas guerras, solo es lógico la preparación y la formación de una conciencia mundial en contra de las mismas.
In the face of these wars, the only logical thing is to be prepared and the formation of a global awareness against those wars.
Pero los cambios climáticos antropogénicos, tan pronto sean conocidas sus causas, pueden ser no solo evitados, sino también revertidos si se toman las medidas adecuadas. Y mientras más rápido estas se tomen, menos daños serán causados.
But climate change, man-made climate change, as soon as we know their causes, they can be avoided, prevented. But also they can only be prevented, but also they can be reversed
Ya sabemos
if we take the appropriate measures.
Ya sabemos que el planeta Tierra está en un equilibrio térmico relativo con el Sol y el universo. Es decir, que toda la energía que la Tierra recibe del Sol y transforma en calor en un periodo, por ejemplo, de un año, la emite al universo, ni más ni menos.
We already know
Lo que
that
mantiene un clima sin calentamiento ni enfriamientos relativos.
we already know that planet Earth is in a constant equilibrium. In relation to the sun and the universe. And that is to say that all the energy that comes from the sun, the earth receives it. And it transforms it into heat in a period of time. For example, that in a course of a year, which maintains a climate without any heating or cooling of the planet.
Este equilibrio térmico ha permitido la vida en el planeta. Su alteración lo pone en peligro.
This thermal equilibrium has permitted life on the planet. Its alteration puts it into peril.
Pero ya sabemos también que este equilibrio se está rompiendo,
But we already know that this equilibrium is already being broken,
lo que ha provocado un calentamiento acelerado del sistema climático, como evidencian los aumentos observados del promedio mundial de la temperatura del aire y del océano.
which has provoked, which has caused an increased speedy heating of the climate system, as the observed increases of the water temperature, the world, of the air and the oceans.
El deshielo progresivo de nieves y hielos permanentes, así como el aumento del promedio mundial del nivel del mar.
As well as the melting of progressive melting of ice, permanent ice, and the increase of the world average of sea level world average.
Se ha incrementado la intensidad de los huracanes, lo que está correlacionado con el incremento de la temperatura en la superficie del agua.
The intensity of hurricanes have increased, which has been correlated with the increase of the temperature on the water surface.
Ha habido un aumento también de áreas afectadas por la sequía y por grandes inundaciones.
There also been an increase in areas affected by droughts and by large floods.
Se acentúan los fenómenos extremos, aumentan las áreas deforestadas y desérticas.
Extreme phenomena aggravate, and those deforestation areas deforested are increased, and desert areas are increased.
Conocemos que las causas principales del cambio climático acelerado son:
We know that the causes for the accelerated climate change
lo primero
include,
es el sistema energético imperante,
so the prevailing energy system,
el sistema agrícola impuesto,
the imposed agricultural system,
el sistema de vida consumista y despilfarrador,
the system of consumerism and squandering lifestyle,
y las guerras de dominación.
and the wars of domination.
El sistema energético imperante contribuye al cambio climático con dos factores:
The prevailing energy system contributes to climate change in two factors.
incorporación de una fuente de calor extra al balance energético del sistema Sol-Tierra, calor producido por los combustibles fósiles y los reactivos nucleares,
Incorporation of a source of heat
y un incremento de los
extra
gases de
source of
efecto
heat
invernadero, principalmente
to
el
the energy
dióxido de
balance.
carbono,
to energy balance system of the sun, earth.
y el gas metano.
That's heat produced by fossil fuels. Also, the increase of the greenhouse effect gases,
Que dificulta el escape de calor emitido por la superficie de la Tierra.
which makes difficult the emission of heat, emitted by the Earth's surface.
El problema del cambio climático antropogénico es muy grave y muy complejo.
Man-made climate change is very serious and complex.
Tan complejo como lo es la sociedad misma,
So
y
complex
en
as it is
particular
society,
el ser humano.
and in particular human being.
Debemos, sin embargo, prepararnos para que, en primer lugar, no nos perjudiquen los efectos negativos del cambio climático, como lo hacemos contra un huracán o contra la guerra frente a un enemigo invasor.
We should, however, prepare ourselves firstly, so that they do not cause any harm to us, that those negative effects do not harm us.
Hoy tenemos condiciones para hacer buenos
we prepare
pronósticos.
in the face of a hurricane or against any invading enemy.
Hoy tenemos condiciones para hacer buenos pronósticos, pero los ciclones causan decenas y centenares de muertes cada año.
Today, we have
Y los
conditions.
efectos económicos son de decenas o cientos de miles de millones de pesos o dólares.
Today,
Valdría la pena dedicar unos cuantos millones en investigaciones para combatirlos. Hemos aprendido bien cómo pronosticarlos, pero no cómo combatirlos.
Today, we have good conditions to make good forecasts, weather forecasts, but we cannot forecast. But hurricanes cause dozens and dozens of deaths every year, and also economic economic effects, which are in the dozens and hundreds of thousands of dollars. It would be wise to allocate a few of those millions of dollars to fight those hurricanes. We have learned well how to forecast them, but not how to combat them.
Por ejemplo, sabemos que los ciclones toman la energía del mar.
For example, we know that hurricanes take
Más caliente
energy
el mar,
from the sea.
Más probabilidades de desarrollo tienen los ciclones.
The hotter the water, the seawater,
Por
more
otro
possibilities
lado,
for the
sabemos que
development.
a profundidades mayores de 800 metros, las aguas marinas tienen entre 5 y 10 grados Celsius,
However, we know that
41 50 grados Fahrenheit.
that in the depths of the sea, the marine waters have between 5 and 10 degrees.
Hemos pensado en utilizar este gradiente termomarino para producir electricidad.
We have thought about using this thermal marine gradient to produce electricity.
Hemos pensado también utilizar las aguas frías de las profundidades para climatizar directamente edificaciones turísticas y almacenes en zonas costeras.
We have also thought about using the cold waters in the depth of the sea.
No pudiéramos con esas mismas aguas frías hacer barreras contra ciclones en algunos lugares por donde frecuentemente pasan.
Couldn't we be able to use these cold waters in the depths of the sea to make some marine barriers
Solo tendríamos que
to
subirla a
avoid
la
those
superficie.
hurricanes from coming through the way they pass?
Solo tendríamos que subirla a la superficie bombeándolas con energía solar.
We'll only be we can only just pump that water from the depths to the surface of the sea.
¿Cuáles serían los puntos de colaboración?
Which would be the points of collaboration?
El primero sería crear el Grupo Internacional de Investigadores Científicos y Colaboradores.
The first would be to create the international group of scientists and collaborators.
Dos, construir barcos, plataformas con potencias fotovoltaicas de aproximadamente 1 megawatt pico,
To build
con el almacenamiento correspondiente y bombas marinas que sean capaces de subir a la superficie las aguas frías de las profundidades marinas en los diferentes lugares donde vayan a pasar los ciclones.
Second, to build platform ships with photovoltaic power stations and marine pumps that could be able to just pump the cold waters from the depths of the sea and use them in the different places where those hurricanes could pass through.
Tres, estudiar los efectos biológicos de las aguas de las profundidades del mar en la superficie.
Three, to study the biological effects of the seawater in the deep waters in the surface.
Cuatro, estudiar la dinámica de las temperaturas en tiempo y espacio de las aguas profundas en la superficie del mar.
Fourth, to study the dynamics of the temperatures in time and space of the water,
Cinco,
of the deep
ver la
waters
cantidad de barcos necesarios.
in the surface, in the sea surface. Also, to the amount of necessary ships.
Yo puse aquí 6 otras investigaciones.
Other investigations, number 6.
Estos barcos en época no ciclónica pudieran apoyar al suministro de electricidad de algunas islas del Caribe.
These ships, when it is not a hurricane season, they can benefit.
Deberíamos aprender a hacer un cambio climático para el bien de la humanidad y no para el mal como lo hemos estado haciendo hasta ahora.
We should learn to make a climate change for the benefits of humanity, not other way around as we have done it up to this moment.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Gracias, Luis. Y un aplauso para todo el panel. Gracias. No tenemos tiempo para preguntas, pero queremos seguir la conversación durante los próximos días. Gracias.
A bombear. Bombear.
Gracias.
Pueden ser. No, hay que ver la cantidad de barcos. Pero una de las cosas es estudiar la cantidad de barcos.
O sea, no es un barco.
No. Cantidad de barcos.